Hey, Jack. Hey, Lawson. Dr. Worm. Matt. Hey, guys. Hey, Derek. Hey, Michaela. Hey, Emma Stewart. Hey, Hadar and Isabella. Emily. Hi, friends. Hey, Tyler. Reagan.
Hello.
Hey, Emily.
Hi.
You guys still hanging in? Transitioning okay?
Barely.
I know, I hear you. It's like we made it. We know we can do it, but it's a challenge.
I'm taking a GIS class,
Oh
and
boy.
for some reason I can't install GIS on my new laptop,
Oh
so
gosh.
I have to call Esri today and try and figure out how to do it.
Oh,
I
that's
called
so
them yesterday and they
stressful.
were pretty helpful. I had the same problem.
Yeah. Did you guys get an email from IT about them kind of masking the machines down in your GIS room? So you could kind of remotely tap into them?
I was gonna do that. I brought it up to my parents, and they were like, "No, we bought you a laptop. You're gonna use your laptop."
Yeah, I get that. Well, hopefully that talk with Esri goes okay.
I hope so.
Well, welcome to Friday. We did it. I've got some props today. I have locked the kids out and given them Lunchables, which is like against my moral judgment, but whatever works. So hopefully we've got our time uninterrupted. I wanted to just make mention of the test. Well done. I kind of scanned through the ones that like auto calculate for me, and everything's looking pretty good. There is one question, and somebody shot me a message yesterday where I think I either coded the answer wrong or I did not even code the answer, and I thought I had double checked everything. So don't worry, if you guys got that one right, I'll go back and look and give everybody back that point. So I hope it worked out okay. It seems like for the most part, everyone was able to access it and work through it. So that's a positive, I guess. So stay tuned. I'm still working on figuring out all that and getting that information to you. In terms of the Minecraft, yes. I was putting that in there hoping someone might. Oh, you chose that one? No. It is the answer to most things, but not that question, I don't think. So next week in lab, I mentioned this to my lab group. I think Dr. Aldred will be reaching out to the group on Monday with her plan. I know for my group, we're going to meet briefly. And I'll probably just be sharing a video or a video link with you because we'll be missing the field experience. So it'll be me and my kids, perhaps the spouse if he's willing, because otherwise it's going to be not so much a 10 by 10 meter square plot. And we'll be doing some demonstration on tree community surveys. So that will be the plan for next week. Consider it, I think, a shortened lab day. But I hope that last week, or actually this week's spider lab went okay for most people. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen, and I think if I do it this way, I might be able to do some of the videos with you guys. Do you see the Zoom sheet right now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we did not quite finish predation. Do you guys see in the predation lecture right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for coaching through. I just want to make sure we're seeing the same thing. All right. So what I did want to remind you guys of, because I remember I said it was tricky, is I want you to, like, every time that we have a class meeting in the next few times that we meet, definitely grab a pen and paper and try and work through this process. If it's tricky, you know, go back and watch the video of me drawing it. Again, we're looking at prey population size and predator population size, and think about what axis they're on, and that would be the direction of response for that particular group of animals. So prey is on the horizontal, it's going to either move right or left, increasing or decreasing, and then the other one's going to be predators on the vertical, going up or down. So again, just think about, you know, grab the vertical and say, oh, that's the predator, it's on the vertical, and look at the axis that it's splitting. Look to the left, look to the right. If we look left, they're dealing with low numbers of prey, low food, their numbers should decline. Over here, we're looking at high numbers of food, so their numbers should increase, so up arrows. Now let's kind of jump over and consider what's happening with the horizontal axis, or the prey. How would their population deal with? Again, let's see what that's splitting. The isocline is splitting predator numbers. When there's low predators, we would expect prey to increase. So increasing on the horizontal means moving right, so 2 little right arrows. And then above, we've got high predators, high predation risk. They would decrease in number. And again, you overlay them with the butt end of the arrows kind of touching, and then you make that resultant vector, and again, visualizing a cycle. And it corresponds to the cycling of predator and prey over time that we see. And there are times when predators will drive their prey to extinction. Usually that's in, like, you know, very simple situations where there's not much complexity to the habitat. But what we really tend to see are these oscillations where predators will increase, and when their numbers increase, they knock down their prey to a low number. And when the prey are at such a low number that the predators can't eat well and make babies, then we see the prey bounce back and the predators decline, and those cycles will continue. And so one of the key things to remember is the reason those oscillations continue is because we have complexity in our habitats. Think about going out for a walk in the woods. Sometimes you have vernal pools, sometimes you have openings where, you know, trees have fallen down. The habitat is very complex. Unless you're in, like, a cornfield, there'll be a lot of these kind of hiding covers so that prey will have a chance to reduce their search image for predators who are really good at finding their special prey. Also, again, the predators being able to switch between prey is really important. So when the prey gets low, their favorite prey, they can switch over to something else, and it allows the other prey to recover, and they can continue on their trajectory. So again, these were the lab experiments kind of showing you, depending on when you introduce the two populations of predator and prey, we could see, you know, an explosion of prey when you're introducing them at the same time, driving the predators to extinction because they didn't have enough food at the time that they were introduced. This one with the lag, when they're introduced, there's not a lot of prey, so they go to extinction. So not a good scenario for predators here. But if we were to pop or immigrate more of those prey into that habitat, we can sustain those dynamics, as we mentioned, a little bit longer. So that's a good thing. And this really cool, very simple experiment was just about habitat complexity, right? If we can arrange our, you know, habitat patches with good food, very complex, like separating them out, it takes the predators a while to get to the prey, and can sustain those dynamics. But if we clustered all the food in one area, all the oranges in one zone of this tray table, then they go right to it and drive each other to extinction. And that's not a good thing if we want them both to kind of coexist. So being able to have complexity, in this case, the guy, remember, he put the Vaseline barriers up and the zip lines and the poles and stuff to kind of give one of them an advantage in dispersal. And so, you know, we gave a real life field example of predator and prey dynamics, like real life stuff that happened, right? Abiotic factors, really harsh winters, disease coming in, that's a biotic factor, right? And dropping the predator numbers down really low, giving the prey, the moose, a chance to bounce back. And my God, the moose in Plattsburgh, of all the times I'm not on campus, I was so bummed. That was so exciting for you guys. Anybody that lived near or your dorm facing that area? Anybody see it?
I saw a video
I have a
online.
video of it.
Yeah, the video was like crazy, you know,
Huge.
props to the police and DEC, because this poor moose was stuck in the pool behind Kodo. And there's a picture of it trying to get out of the in-ground pool, and I have no idea.
Like in a hotel?
Did you guys see that?
No.
That picture?
No.
I'll try and send it to you. But you can see the moose is up on its two front legs trying to get off, and the cops are like lining, and the DEC guy are like lining the perimeter of the pool. And these are one of the most terrifying animals that, you know, having worked with them, you don't want to mess with moose. They can take you out in no time. And so I was thinking to myself, well, if they sedate the moose to get it out, which they would have to, because otherwise it's going to like flail and attack them, then how the heck are they going to lift it out? Because these things are tons. They weigh tons. I mean, it was a yearling male. You guys see the little dewlap here? That that signifies male. And usually the males are the ones that do the wandering. Remember we talked about collaring the squirrels, and they're the ones that have the exploratory movements. So it was definitely a young male. But this is the second one in the time that I've been here that we've found in the city. So, you know, they say their numbers are around 300 in New York or in the Adirondacks. I can't remember which it was, but I don't know. These are good signs.
Yeah, didn't they relocate it somewhere?
Yeah, they relocated it. Oftentimes they relocate them to like Lion Mountain. It's pretty remote out there. Anyways, so again, another major concept besides that model with predation was just thinking about how the predator is at being a predator, right? How good are they? What is their feeding rate? How do they handle their food when there's low or medium or high numbers of food? And so that's the functional response. The numerical response is really just, you know, you've got prey on the landscape, you'll make more predators the more prey you have on the landscape, because they'll kill them and grow and then make more babies. But the functional response is how well they handle them and process them. So Holling came up with the type 1, 2, and 3, and I wanted you guys to just really commit those to memory. They're not tricky ideas, but again, constant rates are type 1. Those are the sit and wait predators. Eating very well, handling them very well at low to moderate numbers of prey on the landscape, but then getting full when there's too many to process, which is like me with all the damn Cadbury mini eggs that you left me. And then for type 3 is sort of like a type 2. They get full at high densities, but at low densities, they just can't find them. The search image is low. They're probably hiding. There's so few of them that they're not feeding well as a result of that. So these were just some real life examples. And then we talked about optimal foraging. You know, we know energetically what would be the best food to go for, but sometimes you just don't pick the best food because of other circumstances, like having to kind of weigh out if there are predators around that are going to kill you. And we talked about, you know, indirect effects of predators, just, you know, that transitive property of having competition between one other member in the community that maybe looks a little bit like predation, having a really important predator in the system that's not super abundant, so it's not dominant, but its role is to keep that competitive dominant species, like the mussels in that starfish example, down to a minimum, allowing for diversity to be greater in the other shellfish that are found there. And then removing a predator can cause crazy cascades. Remember what happened in Yellowstone? No top predator wolf, and we see erosion. We see in the streams, we see aspen trees that don't rebound. They're very stunted. Beaver are gone. Everything kind of falls apart. And then you reintroduce those predators back in, and you see a decline in the herbivores. You see a response of increased growth in the trees that the herbivores would have stunted before. And it creates stabilization on the shoreline, Beavers come back and fish come back because water temperature is less hot, and all that good stuff occurs. So again, here's just the example with the keystone predator on the Rocky Intertidal, like out in California on the coast. You remove this top predator who likes to eat the Mytilus, which is the competitive dominant. And once you do that, this guy increases in number and everybody else declines, and you lose the diversity that you would have had with just a few of those starfish in the system. Again, the response that you see at every other trophic level will definitely vary. Moving on to invasive predators, just one really key example. You guys have probably, and those that fish, you've probably seen this too, when you fish and you look for wounds, those circular wounds of the lamprey. So lamprey made it into the system. They came into the Great Lakes through the Welland Canal. You can see consecutively them moving through the Great Lakes, a little bit of lag time in between having to move through, you know, lake and lock systems. So these are really interesting animals. You know, they live part of their life in marine systems out in the ocean, and they migrate in to the freshwater systems and become parasitic as adults. So we see them in Lake Champlain. And actually had a friend that was swimming across, and she didn't have a wetsuit and had a lamprey stuck to her. That would have been the end of me swimming in Lake Champlain, let me tell you. But here's a visual of what happened to the lake trout before we started doing any kind of lamprey management. And what ends up happening, I'm just gonna kind of scoot this out of the way. I don't know if you see that as well. What ends up happening here is, you know, you've got high numbers of lake trout. As soon as the lamprey enters that particular lake, this was Lake Huron, the first one it entered, immediate declines. So you can see how they could regulate, right? These would be predators or parasites acting like predators, regulating that population of prey. And, you know, dramatic decrease in the trout. And you can see the lag time in when it happened in those other lakes. When you see crashes in fisheries, you see similar responses. You'll see a crash, and then oftentimes, kind of like when we did competitive removal experiments, you'll see a response of others that competed maybe with that really important fishery. You'll see them increase and fill that niche. So that's kind of an interesting response when fish kind of collapse. And then finally, just an interesting, I found this to be a fascinating way of treating an invasive predator. So for whatever reason, you know, we know that island systems are very delicate. They're smaller, less niche availability and resources. And these organisms that are found on there just never evolved defenses of dealing with predators. So they're kind of sitting ducks when an introduced predator comes into the system. So mongoose are a big one. Mongoose are generalist predators that have been brought into these areas. And also the brown tree snake in Guam, which causes a lot of electrical outages in Guam for people, but also eats everything. So the snake got in probably on a container ship, and has been eating everything. So in Guam, there's an endemic, you guys know that term now, right, from our spider lab, only found in Guam, the Guam rail, like a little shorebird type thing. And it has really knocked their numbers down to, you know, nothing. So what they're doing is they are poisoning mice. They are taking mice, feeding them acetaminophen, and dropping them from planes. And that seems to negatively impact survival of these snakes that will go after them. And it seems to be a fairly effective mechanism of dealing with this invasive predator. I thought that was pretty resourceful. Very interesting stuff. So make sure as you guys are going through, again, this is a community interaction. Our first one was competition. That was a negative. This is an example of a plus negative. We talked about them being regulators, right? Altering birth or death, doing it more so at high densities. They can, and we saw examples with that with the skunk and the nesting ducks. We talked about the model, we drew it a few times. We talked about how good a predator you are, what's your feeding rate according to how much prey on the landscape. Those are the Hollings types 1, 2, and 3. And then we mentioned invasive predators. So make sure you guys are comfortable with predation. Any questions on that PowerPoint?
No, I don't think so.
All right, good. That's a fun one, I think. Can you guys see the Symbiosis lecture up right now, all the slides?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, so we'll give this one a shot. This is one of my favorites because I have some props. So we've got a lot of symbioses. Symbioses, I just want to kind of clarify, it's not just mutualism, which is like helpers, plus. It's a bunch of different things. Symbiosis just means a tight relationship between two organisms that live in close proximity. So it could be plus negative, it could be plus, and as you'll learn, it could also be plus 0. Here's an example with the mountain tree shrew and the pitcher plant. I'll put a hyperlink, well, I'll play that in a sec. And also the parasitized snail that's been parasitized by a worm and basically takes over their antenna. It's pretty gross. You guys are probably familiar with the coral and the dinoflagellate Symbiodinium, which is a helper. The coral is an animal, right? It needs to be able to get food. So this little dinoflagellate is photosynthesizing and able to give them sugar, and the coral is giving them a place to live. You guys remember the leafy sheep sea slug? Remember how cute it was? What's cool about that is they have actually kind of acted like a parasite in the sense that they have been kleptoparasitizing plastids, in particular chloroplasts, right? Brought them into their body, and so when they're in a rough situation, like not a lot of food, photosynthesis can occur within them because they have like, you know, stolen those plastids, which is pretty darn awesome. All right, so let me try and pull up that video. You guys see our best friend David Attenborough? Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Try and make it louder.
Scientists discovered that the plant gets its nitrogen in a quite different way, and we couldn't resist going back to see if we could find out what the truth was. Mount Kinabalu in Sabah is home to many Raja pitcher plants. They certainly seem to attract insects that fall into their bowls just as other pitchers do, but they also have larger visitors. A tree shrew.
High metabolism. High metabolism.
It's licking the underside of the ring, where the pitcher secretes nectar with which it lures visitors. But even though its backside is hanging over the bowl, it doesn't seem to be in any danger of falling in and drowning. So what's going on? It leaves a clue, a dropping. So the pitcher is a tree shrew toilet. The tree shrew feeds by licking the secretions from the pitcher plant's lid, and the pitcher plant gets its fertilizer by collecting the tree shrew's droppings.
Pretty cool. All right, can you guys see the zombie snail? I'm going to play that one next.
Beneath this peaceful landscape, a snail has eaten parasites. They've turned it into a zombie. These spectacular, bizarre, bulging eyeballs are the snail's tentacles. Inside them, parasitic worms have begun an amazing feat of mind control. These parasites have taken over the snail's tentacles and its brain. It's all part of an ingenious plan to extend the life of the parasite and its offspring. The snail has become possessed. It is doomed now to follow the parasite's will. The parasite is on the move, looking for another host. Next, the parasite meets a bird. Hypnotized, the snails march into the sunshine. They climb from the shade to the tips of exposed branches above. The snail's tentacles, engorged now by their possessors, have grown to resemble a maggot, and a maggot is the favorite food of the birds above.
Don't do it.
In an instant, the bird attacks, and the parasite triumphs. The parasitic worm happily multiplies in the bird's stomach. Its final trick is to complete the cycle, but it will have little trouble as the snails below graze on bird droppings, filled with a new batch of mind-controlling parasites. Once they're eaten, the hypnosis of the snails will continue, and the life cycle of the parasite will roll on.
Terrible. I'm telling you, parasites, if I had another, turn at what my topic of research was going to be, parasites. So if any of you guys know Alyssa Gleichner, she's doing some pretty cool stuff. We try and team up on our plastics because we think that parasitism happens more often when there's microplastics in their bellies. So all this good stuff, right? So we're going to talk about what, how do we define a symbiosis? Again, I sort of did that, just a close interaction of two organisms. Parasitism is one example of it. It's a plus minus, and that's just like predation, remember. We'll talk about types of parasites. We'll talk about host parasite responses, very timely, right? Commensalism, which is the +0 interaction. So the zero is that the negative, like they've evolved a way to not be harmed. Like a little bit of coevolution. Mutualism is the ++, and we'll talk about how the mutualism can actually turn back into predation or parasitism if conditions change. So, there may be a situation where it's hard to live in that area, so having a helper is great, but what if conditions become good, then that helper actually ends up harming, and that happens sometimes. So again, symbiosis, intimate prolonged association between two organisms, two different species. They co-evolve, so it's kind of that evolutionary arms race like we saw with predator and prey, kind of anti-predator behaviors, right? And oftentimes it'll result in unique specialization. So when we're threatened by climate change and global change, if you lost one that was so tightly, tied to the other, you would lose both. So we see these kind of double losses and extinctions. So as I mentioned, a symbiosis can be both, well, it can be three things, right? Positive, negative, and neutral. It's on kind of a spectrum. Parasitism being the plus minus, like predation was, but obviously they're kind of act like more like a herbivore, right? Because if they immediately kill the host, then they die too. So we kind of saw that with the examples. Commensalism, one benefits and the other one doesn't seem to have a negative impact. So they've, evolved some strategy to not be harmed anymore. And then mutualism is the best of both worlds. It's a ++. Everybody's happy. So parasitism, it's again that plus minus. We're going to have a parasite, which is usually smaller. Here's an example of a leech on a painted turtle. I see them all the time. And so they tend to be smaller than their host, and they tend to not kill their host, at least immediately, right? They'll harm them to some extent. So consider the host the habitat, right? That's where they live. Whether it's inside or outside of the host, it is their habitat. It is the parasite's habitat. And their job, because they are regulators of their host, right, will be to alter birth or death rates or both, or reduce their fitness, right, of the host. And as I mentioned, they're typically smaller, and obviously they're not going to try and kill, they're not going to be so virulent usually that they kill everybody, or else they're not going to persist very long. So in terms of categorizing them, we've got micro and macro, and we also have endo and ecto. So I'll give some examples. Micro means small, and macro means big, so it should be easy. If you can see them with the naked eye, they're typically macro. So fleas, leeches, a fungal pathogen. Have you guys been outside and seen what looks like dog throw up on like mulch? Maybe I'm the only one. Like brown, orangey color. That's a water mold, so that would be considered something like that. But ticks are a good example. The bigger ones will often have multiple hosts. So maybe they'll feed on a mouse one season, then they'll go and feed on a deer in another season. Micros are the ones you need the scope for. Smaller size, shorter generation time, often just found in one host. The spirochete bacteria for Lyme does switch hosts, but that is an example of a microparasite. Also protozoa inside the bellies. We talked about, I think, rumen gut bacteria and protozoa in termites. We'll talk about that. But I thought it really timely, right? Endo and ecto, meaning inside and outside. So we've got our insides, the endoparasites, right? So the termites, protozoa that helps them to digest the wood, the lignin, and the COVID virus, right? So COVID stands for coronavirus disease. My kids asked me and I wasn't sure, so I had to look what COVID stood for. And the 19 is because it originated in 2019. So I lectured about this. We were talking about overexploitation in my conservation class. I lectured on Tuesday, and this was the map of COVID cases. And now this is where we are today. So it hasn't been that long. You'll notice some of these locations, like Florida, for example, they have gotten darker, right? So cases just keep increasing kind of in that exponential, frightening fashion. Remember, we talked about exponential growth. An endoparasite lives within the body, so a virus, right? Or a protozoa, as we talked about. And the ectoparasite's gonna live on the outside, in the fur, skin, fleas, ticks, those sorts of things. They can carry the endoparasite. So think about a tick. A tick is an ectoparasite, but it carries an endoparasite, that bacterium. So I wanted to throw in a little bit of the COVID stuff. I think I mentioned to my lab group at least that I'm reading Pandemic. And one of the, they're talking about SARS, which is kind of it's a coronavirus disease. So there's similar behaviors. So I was looking up, how did this COVID originate? What they're thinking of is that it originated, and this is where my conservation bio class comes in, it originated in one of those wet markets. There's a term called Yewei, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Y-E-I-W-E-I, which is sort of the gourmet use of exotic animals. So imagine these outdoor markets, like where we would kind of think of the Italian market or the vegetable market outside, but it's animals, exotic animals that are not usually found side by side in cages, and some are slaughtered there as well. And so bodily fluids are being exchanged, and disease jumps across species. So zoonotics or zoonoses, this is a term it's a wild animal disease, and it can jump species, and oftentimes that is kind of where we find ourselves with these emerging diseases, is that they originate in these wild habitats. Now think about in the tropical rainforest, when you deforest the tropical rainforest, which we know is bad for so many reasons, right? Nutrient cycling and all that. But what does it do to the animal populations when you cut your forest, which is their big habitat? Where do the animals go?
Like into cities?
Yeah, they come in closer contact. They have less available habitat, and it puts them in closer contact with the villages. And that is where like SARS begins and monkeypox begins. And then they mutate in different hosts. So the origins they mention here, there's two scenarios. It started off in bats, fruit bats, which are very messy eaters, saliva all over the place, and other animals. Secondary hosts could have picked up the virus from the waste of stuff that they were eating, and so it jumps maybe to other animals like I need to scoot that down. Civet cats was an example. And then over here was a suggestion of pangolins, that many, and the bats, I should say, have like interesting immune systems. They've got hollow bones and these weird immune systems. They roost in high densities and they travel far. So that's why they often are the ones associated with these crazy diseases. And then they often will jump to things like civet cats. And so the pangolin is another one, which is my favorite animal. And I'm so upset that this is possibly the cause, but they think it may have perhaps transmitted again from pangolin to civets and ferrets and then on to us. So these are, working hypotheses as to ways this could have happened. But that's kind of what we're dealing with, and I wanted to just kind of throw that in there because it's super relevant. Do you guys remember like 2 years ago, there were these like upticks in measles too, in certain hotspots where vaccinations weren't occurring? Again, an endoparasite, just kind of showing you what measles is like and how it's typically cyclical, and then you vaccinate and you don't see it very often unless you have groups that decide that vaccinations are not a good thing, and then you lose your herd immunity and bad news. So an example, Lyme disease, again, ecto and endo, it's a little bit more of a complex system. Many hosts are involved. You're familiar with the black-legged tick, right? This is the male, this is the female, these are the adults. Again, for size reference, this is a poppy seed, this is a sesame seed. These you can these are the ones you typically see. So imagine you start off in year 1, okay? Female ticks are laying their eggs, they hatch, and then they go and find mice. And that's why having diversity in your forest is good, because you have less mice and more squirrels and shrews and chipmunks that don't carry them as well. When you have more acorns, remember we talked about this before, you have more mice and you'll have more ticks, right? So then they will feed on the mice, they will morph into the nymph, they'll overwinter, and then they will emerge and they will go find another animal like our pets, ourselves, birds, things like that, feed again, transmit the Borrelia burgdorferi spirochete, which is the Lyme disease. And again, they're picking it up from the mouse. So the ticks are picking it up on that first blood meal from that mouse. And then they're transmitting it to us along the way. Usually the adult deer are the ones that feed on the adult deer tick are the ones that feed on the deer and then drop off once they've fed. So, you know, there's a lot of things that play into this, right? We have high precipitation, temperature fluctuations, we get more acorns, and that whole thing exacerbates. If we have extreme habitat fragmentation, you're going to have more mice on the landscape. All of these things kind of play into it, but this is a complex type of a parasitic disease. And just what I said earlier, right? Number of hosts, high diversity, have chipmunks, have opossum, have your squirrels, you tend to have more hosts and less parasites per host. The more that you just have, you know, one host, mostly the mice, the greater number of parasites you'll have. This is a disease that's not Lyme, but it is another tick-borne disease. The more forest cover you have, the probability of having that disease is less. The same is true of Lyme, though. The more forest, the bigger your area of your patch, your island, your forest, the less mice you will have. Mice like edge. They don't like big, large, you know, areas that have a lot of core. They like edge and small habitats. And so there's ways we can manage our forests and our you know, woodlots or where we live to reduce our chances of getting Lyme. In terms of plants, there's a couple of plant parasites. I want you guys to commit these terms to memory. Holo, complete, holo, holistic, right? Holistic medicine. And hemi, partial, right? There's trucks that are called hemis, some engines or something, partial. So holoparasites, these are plant parasites that have to be with their host in order to survive. And a hemiparasite doesn't always have to be. It's so one you can imagine is going to need to be able to get sugar from its host plant. The other one will have the ability to do some photosynthesis themselves. So think of ones that are white or no accessory pigments at all that need to tap into their host. Those would be the holoparasites. So completely parasitic. This dodder, D-O-D-D-E-R, is a plant that taps in. It's yellow, right? But mostly like a white-brown yellow. It's just not photosynthesizing. It's tapped into the host plant. Without it, it would die. So completely means holo. Hemi is partial. So if you guys have been out west and seen clumps of clustered kind of weird looking things in the trees, that is often a mistletoe. The mistletoe we're familiar with. There's different species. But it has green. So if you were to get a cross section of this, you'd see that it is still able to photosynthesize. The phainopepla is a desert bird that likes to eat the seeds of the mistletoe. And when it defecates, just like we saw with the zombie snail, on a branch, it will spread more of the parasitic, mistletoe. And that's why you see it clustered in different locations on that same tree, because likely that bird host defecated and then it kind of tapped into the plant at that point. But it can live on its own, as I said, but it also can tap into the host. So how do the hosts respond, right? It's like predator-prey, right? They've got to have an immune response. They've got to have a behavioral response so that they don't immediately die. And so some of the things that, I saw with my research is that, elk or moose will go to high elevations when mosquitoes are at really high densities. Certain seasons when mosquitoes are unbearable, they go to high elevation. And so there's going to be less of those mosquitoes. So they can shift their microhabitats, spatially relocate away from those parasites. But they could also eat them. So, right, the opossum eats the ticks. That's one of the things that we note. And so that's kind of an important thing. They can also eat good foods that will like flush the system, and that we see happening as well. The other response, besides the behavioral, moving out of the area to avoid the densities of those parasites, is to have that like bodily response, so the immune response. And so oftentimes, when we get bit by things, we get these rashes, white blood cells kind of running to the area of infection, scabs to prevent more infection. In plants, we see something similar, but they're called galls. So I actually did some fun work out in the yard the other day. Can you guys see that? That is an oak bullet gall. On the walk with the dog, I found it. So there are insects out there that will lay, females will lay their little larvae inside twigs, on leaves, in stems of goldenrod over here. And then the plant doesn't want to be like killed, so it cavitizes it like the scab. And so tissue grows around it at the expense of the plant's growth or reproduction, like seed production, but it contains that larvae. And so you'll just see it in that one area. And again, it comes at an expense, so it is like that regulation that we talked about. So there's that negative impact, but galls are really interesting things. And when we think about, can that parasite regulate the host population? I've hyperlinked this and I have it down here, but in terms of time, I want to kind of skip over it. I have most of the take homes here. There is a parasite, a nematode, a little roundworm that gets into these ants, which are not normally very tasty to birds. It gets in like the zombie snail kind of idea, and it turns their abdomen, or what they call gaster, into something that looks like a ripe red berry, which would be attractive to who wants to eat red berries? Birds, yeah. And then they will eat it, go somewhere else, defecate, and pass on more of those nematodes that'll get uptaken by them. So obviously we're reducing survival and likely, birth potential of these ants. And so the parasite is totally regulating this population. And they drop their gaster in some cases, which I think is kind of interesting. So again, for a parasite to regulate its host, it needs to alter birth or deaths, right? So altering births, here's a couple of examples. Western fence lizards, really cute, nice crypsis right there, right? When they are infected by malaria, this Plasmodium parasite, when they're infected with malaria, they have smaller clutches of babies, so they have less offspring, about 20% less. These are zebra finches. You can see them in PetSmart. Their secondary characteristic is the bright color, right? It increases matings. They get that when they're healthy and eating good food, right? So they need to have food that's got good carotenoids in them, like we eat carrots, and it absorbs free radicals. So otherwise they're not as healthy, and the males won't be as colorful. And the females actually, when they are parasitized, can't store the fat. And you all know, like, first you survive, then you grow when you have more energy, and then if you have more energy, you'll have babies. And so that, they're less able to have offspring. In terms of mortality, other examples, here we have our cute little bunny, and the bunny, when it's infected with tularemia, they get slow, they get sluggish, so they're not able to go as fast on the landscape. Predators will get them And over here, this killifish, when it's infected with a trematode, which Alyssa studies a lot, more trematodes in the fish, they swim weird, and they will obviously be eaten by birds more often, say like our osprey. More cysts, more weird behavior, more readily eaten by the predators. Here we have the little pill bugs. I'm sure you guys have picked up rocks and seen pill bugs, right? When they are parasitized versus not parasitized, we see the change in their hiding cover. When they are parasitized, the amount of time they spend under cover, which would be a good survival mechanism, is very low. And when they don't have parasites, they will hide under rocks, which is a good move. So, you know, back to the situation with what we've got going on right now with COVID, right? There's a model, percent of your population over time. We start off as susceptible individuals. This is the SIR model. We're all susceptible, right? And over time, if some virus gets us, more of us become infected, dropping the number of susceptibles down, okay? Our number of infection will peak, right? As some begin to recover, and that infection rate declines. So this is the SIR model. Remember the flattening curve we've been seeing a lot, the social distancing, that's very important, right? Parasites have to weigh being intense, like COVID seems to be, being able to pass itself on and not kind of immediately drive itself to extinction. In new areas, like, you know, coming into humans, we don't have defenses built up, no immune response for this to deal with the best way we could. So it spreads rapidly, furiously, and we have to make, you know, change, behavioral change, which is what you guys are all doing. Thank you. Keeping everybody well. Oops. And so also poverty. So socioeconomics plays into it. The more wealthy you are, the less disease you will have. The negative value means less disease. That seems to, you know, it's one of those social justice and environmental justice type things. In areas that there's more poverty, there tends to be higher rates of disease, more so in the tropics we see. There's some, you know, hyperlinks in here to some diseases that are on the rise, some that have kind of worked their way out, just some things I threw in there. If you were interested, you can check them out, no big deal. I want to move on to commensalism again, just briefly. This is the +0. So the negative has devolved, right? They've had some strategy, they've evolved to be better at surviving, right? So it doesn't really harm them. So a fiddler crab moving into somebody else's shell, well, that animal's probably dead, so it doesn't harm them. We go out and get stuff, and our dogs too get stuff stuck on us, those seeds. Doesn't really harm us, and we are dispersing them. Shells on top of other shells, barnacles on tops of the whales, Spanish moss kind of growing on a tree. It's just kind of sitting there absorbing nutrients and moisture, not harming the photosynthetic capacity of those plants. A mutualism is a plus. This is the win-win for everybody, right? Everybody's happy. So leafcutter ants and acacia, we'll talk about them in a little while. But everybody's happy. You're going to increase growth, survival, reproduction. You probably, you know, it's a little bit of that survival of the fittest, or kind of war. You know, one evolves this, the other one's got to evolve that, or else they can become parasitic in some way. But if you have a helper, if you have a mutualist, you can actually increase your realized niche, right? You can do better in a tough situation. You can also increase your carrying capacity, which is pretty cool to see. This is normal. This is if you have your helper. So think about rhizobia, bacteria that help converting nitrogen and giving it to the plant. Those are the little circles on the root nodules, the root hairs. Think about actomycorrhizal fungi that increases the rhizosphere so that they can suck up more water on a plant, right? In a stressful situation, you will more often increase stress. You will more often have helpers, right? So this trend line here shows that when you have more stress, you will have more mutualistic interactions. So think about our biomes that are stressful, okay? Desert would be a good example. In areas with less stress, you will have more competitive interactions. That typically tends to be what we find. So again, context dependent. If, you know, soil nutrients are low, then you will have, you know, mutualistic ectomycorrhizal fungi that'll give you more nutrients, it'll give you more trace nutrients and water. But if all of a sudden you have great conditions, you've got somebody tapping into you that maybe is not helping you anymore. So there's a cost. You know, when you have herbivores around, it's good to have a helper. These little ants will fight off other insects. They gain a benefit of eating, you know, some nice fatty cells inside of these thorns. But when there's no, you know, other insects around trying to eat the plant, then they actually are sapping some of the energy from the plant that they were protecting, and it becomes kind of a parasitic relationship. These cleaner wrasse, right? These animals that they will feed on, you know, eat the ectoparasites off of the other fish. That's a situation where that seems to be helpful, right? That's a win-win. This little guy's getting food, this little guy's getting less parasites, but what if this one gets a little bit more aggressive and starts eating the mucus that protects these guys from other infection? And that's what we see, is that when there's, you know, that there's that kind of like tipping point where they can switch to being a little bit more negatively impacting these animals. It really does depend. Having the wrasse around seems to allow for more of the fish to be in the community, more diversity. So these tend to be more helpful than harmful. So mutualists are obligate and facultative. I want to end with my little demonstration. Obligate means they have to be with their partner. And then facultative means they don't have to be with their partner. What I have right here is a yucca, a pod of the yucca tree. If any of you guys have been out west, there are these big white tall inflorescence, and I'm going to try and turn it. Can you guys see that little hole?
Yeah.
So that is, again, a moth, a female, who has like laid her eggs inside of the yucca inflorescence. The fruit here, it's going to feed, it's going to digest the larvae as it's kind of growing. If that female lays too many of those larvae, then this plant has evolved a strategy to drop that flower, that fruit. It doesn't want to be over parasitized. That's what happens here. When there's too many eggs in it, it will drop its flower. The benefit to this moth is that it pollinates, right? The female will lay her eggs, so she benefits reproductively, but she's also rubbing around and going to pollinate, cross-pollinate the yucca. There is a unique moth for most of the yuccas out west. It's pretty exciting. So when you lose one, you lose the other. That's the thing. But those yucca moths are, they are obligate. Those would be an example of obligate. The other one, and I'm going to end with this, okay? The other one is the fig and the fig wasp, okay? And I'm going to just enjoy my fig Newtons while you guys watch this video, okay? It's very quick, but I think it'll be worth it.
The male wasp's next job is to cut flowers. The white anthers contain pollen and must be chopped down for the females. Their mission is to carry the queen's pollen to other trees.
Let me just show you this slide. I'm sorry I'm keeping you over a minute. All right, so we have, you guys have eaten one of these, right? They're delish, right? When you eat them, what is the consistency? Anybody? Is it a smooth bite? Anybody?
Yeah, I don't know.
They crunch, right? They crunch, right? Okay. So the female, she'll oviposit into the fig, right? The flowers of the fig are on the inside, okay? She lays her larvae into these ovules of the flowers, okay? And when she does do that, they will turn into a gall, similar to what we saw in what I showed you with the oak or with the goldenrod. They will emerge. Males have to kind of, the male wasps are going to emerge. They travel looking for the female, and while they're traveling, they're rubbing all over the flowers, fertilizing them, right? The males then, you know, mature. The female wasps come out of the gall. The male burrows a tunnel so the females can exit, but before the female exits, they mate with them, and then they die. the females emerge, right? The female wasp escapes through the tunnel, flies to another fig where she lays her eggs, and then she dies inside the fig too. So the next time you guys eat the fig Newton and it crunches, I want you to think about this. I'm bad. If you're out in the wild, if you're out in the tropics and you crunch on a native fig, that might be the scenario that you encounter. But anyway, these look like seeds to me and not wasp exoskeletons. And on that note, I hope you guys have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday to finish up the lecture. Sound good?
Yep.
All right.
Good weekend.
Yep, have a good
See ya.
weekend.
You too. Get your fig Newtons.